This is Frederick and Rosemary West, a happy couple, prolific parents, and yet serial killers who created their own torture chamber, where they tortured and killed young girls together. This is a story about a friendship that created and destroyed the very idea of family. Oh, sit more comfortably, dear ones, because this is very, very scary. The right upbringing is that very fall when childhood greatly influenced the formation of real monsters in the future. It starts from the very beginning. Fred West was born on the 29th of September, 1941 in the small village of Muchmarkel, England, to poor farm workers Walter and Daisy West. In 10 years, Fred's mother gave birth to 6 children, of which only 6 survived, and Fred was the oldest of them. As I said, the Wests were very poor, and it was extremely difficult for them to provide for the family, a task they were not up to. And it would be fine if the lack of money was compensated by respect and care for their children. But this was not the West way. From an early age, the children learned that in order to survive, they needed to work constantly. Fred, along with his brothers, took care of wheat harvesting and rabbit hunting, while his sisters gathered hops and berries. Fred's father was a disciplinary fanatic who tried to control every aspect of his family's life. On the other hand, their mother doted on her children, especially Fred. She constantly accompanied him to school, even when the boy was old enough to go there on his own. When he was 12 years old, he had his first sexual experience with his own mother. According to him and their culture, it was considered normal. The father constantly slept with his own daughters, just as the mother slept with Fredo. Is this shit? This is shit. At 15, he quit school and went to work on a local farm. 2 years later, he was hospitalized due to a severe motorcycle accident. Then Fred received a brain contusion, due to which he was in a coma for 8 days. After his recovery, the guy returned to work. But now he was constantly haunted by sudden bouts of aggression. 2 years later, Fred fell with a fire axe and was unconscious for 24 hours. Even he, Fred West, in his 20s, has only sexual and psychological violence from his father behind him, which has become the norm for him. Constantly lacking money, which has grown into some kind of productivity complex, when you have to constantly work, otherwise you just don't deserve to live. Additionally, a severe head injury compounded previous experiences by 2 or even 3 times. Not so long ago, he was arrested for the first time in his life. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he was first arrested at 20, not earlier. Aid was far from what we would call adequate. At 20, he was accused of molesting a 13-year-old girl, his sister, who had previously run away from him. Oh, and today's story. When Fred was questioned by the police, he calmly admitted that he had been engaging not only with his sister, but also with other girls of her age for several years. But what puzzled the police most was his question. Don't all people do this? Then at the last moment, Fred's sister refused to testify against him in court, and the case closed itself without a logical conclusion. At 21, Fred started dating Catherine Costello. The girl got involved in prostitution and was already noticeable from one of her clients. However, the young couple still married that same year. They then relocated to Coatbridge, where Catherine delivered her daughter, Charmaine. Because the child was of mixed race, the couple did not want to acknowledge her as their own, so they told everyone that their child had died at birth, and they had adopted Charmaine in place of the deceased child. In the following year, 1964, Catherine gave birth to her first child with Fred, a daughter named Anna Maria. During this period, Mr. West worked as a truck driver for Morozov, or more precisely, the same Morozov, who often turns out to be the main villain in horror stories. Guess Mr. Mercedes. I guessed right away. If you haven't seen or read it, do so, that's it. Later, suspicions arose that this van Fred used to lure and kidnap children, but they never found any concrete evidence of this. His career ended here with the murder of a 4-year-old boy, whom Fred killed in this very van. Nobody knows for sure, but someone does. Now, in order to escape the curse, he took his family and moved as quickly as possible to a caravan site, a place where people live in wheeled huts. Along with them moved Catherine's friend Ann McFoll and the children's nanny Asa McNeil. The enigma was the children's minds, who lived more like beasts than people. In 1966, the friend and nanny left Fred due to his constant, aggressive sexual advances. However, Mrs. McFall remained with Fred because she had fallen in love with him and soon became pregnant. She herself became the first known victim of Fred West. In her 8th month of pregnancy, Anne McFall disappeared. As it would become known later, Fred West killed her, dismembered her body, cut the fetus from her womb, after which he buried all parts of her body in the garden, except for fingers, hands, and legs. He kept the trophies after the murder and continued living normally. He worked at several construction sites, but was repeatedly fired for theft. Katerina visited her children once every few months. However, on her last visit, she transfers all rights to the care of the house to her daughters Fredova, the same Fredovi from whom she herself fled due to constant abuse. Now, this violent and mentally unstable individual is left as the sole guardian of two girls, and this clearly did not end well. Fred didn't stay single for long and soon met his female counterpart, Rose Letts. Who is she, that female version of Fred? Well, Rosemary Letts was born on November 29, 1953 in the town of Northam, which is also in England, to the couple William and Daisy Letts. Her mother suffered from chronic depression, which was constantly treated with electroconvulsive therapy, including during pregnancy. There is also a thought that this could have affected the development of her daughter even before birth. William Letts had schizophrenia and was prone to violence, including sexual towards his older daughters. Oh, damn. Rose considered this normal, so it's not surprising that she herself soon began to abuse her younger brothers, who were 8-9 years old. For Rose, such family life was completely normal. She thought that this is how it is done in other families, exactly the same as Fred thought. Well, not all 20-year-old boys abuse 13-year-old girls. In 1968, Rose first met Fred West at a bakery where she was working at the time. At that time, he was 27 and she was 15. Apparently, such an age difference did not bother Fred, quite the contrary. Perhaps he saw Rose as an innocent victim, but it turned out there was a lot in common between the two. And she's not a victim, but rather a partner. When Fred began to push for, let's say, a closer relationship, the girl didn't just resist, she herself suggested new and more sophisticated ways of getting satisfaction. No wonder, with such a set of shared obsessions and deviations, the couple began to get into trouble very quickly. It all occurred in a flash, both happening and not happening simultaneously. Rosemary often visited Fred's trailer and was curious about the fragments of Anna Marie. Soon she left her job at Kremnica and started working as a nanny for her boyfriend's daughters. Rose's brother strongly disliked Fred and even called social services to place the girl in a home for troubled teenagers. She spent just over 3 months there until her 16th birthday when they released her. Then Fred and Rose started living together. These two, as representatives, perhaps, of the worst families in England at that time, created their own family with their own family values, which were normal for them in childhood. That's what the disaster looked like at its beginning. In 1970, Rosemary realized that she was pregnant with Fred. The father's hatred for her grew, and he forbade her from returning home. However, Rose wasn't too upset by this. Fred, Charmin, Anna Mori, and the speaker moved to an apartment on Midland Road, 25 in Gloucester. That same year in the fall, Rose gave birth to their first child, Heiser. Immediately after that, Fred was again imprisoned for theft at work, this time for a long 6.5 months. At her 18, Rose was left alone with 3 children and began to severely punish Charmin and Anna Marie. She also attempted to call her mother, despite their age gap being only 10-11 years. It was hard to consider Rose a good mother or caring grandmother. The girl was really annoying to the children, especially Charmin, who was a strong spirit and refused to cry or ask for forgiveness. When Rose tried to provoke her, she was met with a wooden spoon and was belittled. In March 1971, Charmin ended up in the hospital with a knife wound to her nose. Rose explained it as an unfortunate accident at home, and soon the girl disappeared in principle in June. Neighbors began to ask Rose where Charmin was living and received a response. Her biological mother took her. At that moment, Charmin's body was hidden in the basement of their building. However, she didn't lie there for long. On June 24th, Fred West was released from prison and returned home. And the first thing he did when he found out about the death of his so-called daughter was to dig up her naked body in the backyard, having previously cut off her fingers and toes. He was not bothered by either the fact of the child's death or that she died at the hands of his own daughter. Then Fred talked to Rose about his past crimes. The couple somehow found another common passion: incest. In August 1971, Catherine came to Fred to check on her children. However, she only saw one daughter before Fred suffocated her in his car, despite her silence. After which he dismembered the body according to a familiar scenario, took her fingers, and buried them in the garden. near his previous victim, Anne McFall. After the death of his wife, through a series of manipulations, Fred changed his status to widower in the documents. On January 29, 1972, he married Rose. Shortly after, the couple moved to a fortified building on the next street, 25 Cromwell Street, which would later become infamous as the House of Horrors. On June 1st, Rose gave birth to their second shared daughter. From her birth date, they named the girl May June. Over the next 11 years, Rose would give birth to another 8 children. At least 3 of them would not be Fred's. To buy a house in town, the West started seeking ways to make money, which they found rapidly. They started renting out rooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors of their building, providing them with passive income. But this was not enough. Then Fred created the Mendy Room upstairs. In it, Rose, under a pseudonym, began to provide intimate services. The room had everything necessary, even more. A large mirror, a peephole for viewing the next room, and a special lamp that glows red when Mendy has a client. And of course, warned the children that they could not enter their mother's room. Fred was always eager to bring in more clients. He even placed an ad in service in the local newspaper. But it was nothing like a Primus from his side. Rose, with her psychopathy, nymphomania, and sadism, was very satisfied with a similar job. Adopted, as stated in most sources, Fred enjoyed such a business, often watching through a hole what was happening in the room, or even participating in it himself. In addition to clients, Rose also often took in her own tenants, both men and women. During sex with women, Rose showed herself as a sadist who derived pleasure from total domination. The West collected a whole collection of phrases to ensure their control over their sexual partners. These were handcuffs, bandages, toys, photos, and videos of sexual abuse, including over minors, and even animals. All this boiled down to one thing: Fred and Rose's obsession to degrade and dominate over women, which grew in essence simply out of control. As you can imagine, the atmosphere in the house was more like a brothel than a family home. For about 7 years, the children were made to do housework, and if they failed, they were severely punished. Mrs. Rose was particularly responsible for the physical abuse of the children, who could beat any of them simply because she was in a bad mood. Even Fred occasionally fell victim to this. At the same time, they were preparing their basement, which they ominously called the underground. In fact, for those clients whom they did not want to let go alive, so to speak, they tested it on their own children. In August 1972, Fred and Rose went down to the basement together with Anna Marie, where they forced the girl to undress. Rose held her while Fred hovered over the child. Rose explained it this way:
"It hurts me, but everyone does it. It's Daddy's job. Don't worry, don't tell anyone about this."
After such events, the torturers could look for a new victim underground. The victim was Carolina Owens, a 17-year-old girl who had been living with them for a while, but not for long. As soon as she realized they were after her, she turned around and ran away. But they didn't give up that easily. They chased her and tried to convince her to come back, but they ended up throwing her into the basement, tied her up, and left her at the mercy of their sick desires. For 2 days, they tortured and beat the girl, slowly killing her with their abuse. But after they proposed to return to work as a nanny, Carolina saw the opportunity to escape, so she waited for the proposal. She stayed with them for a few more days, and then, at the first opportunity, she escaped through the back door of the building. Or was it the back exit? They arrested the suspect for assault, bodily harm, and kidnapping. But in court, Carolina decided that she could not testify against them, and all charges were dropped. It was very close. She almost managed to leave these monsters to rot in jail for the rest of their lives. But they were released and taught a serious lesson. Victims cannot be allowed to come out from under the rubble. In April 1973, Linda Goff appeared at the building on Cromwell Street. The 19-year-old girl had affairs with 2 of his tenants. She often visited them and eventually moved into the building essentially. The last thing she would get in her life would be the collapse of this evil building and 2 sick tenants who are lusting over her. Fred and Rose hung the girl on hooks to the wooden beam. To muffle her screams, they wrapped all her face with packing tape and inserted a small tube into her nose to allow her to breathe, so the girl wouldn't die immediately. This time, the victim couldn't escape. Linda died from shock during the torture in the basement of the house on Cromwell. As always, Fred dismembered the body, took his trophies, and buried it, but this time under the garage in a shallow grave. After a few weeks, Linda's mother came to look for her daughter, but she smelled something strange. She smelled like a child, so we evicted her from the apartment a few weeks ago. Later that same year, 2 more women were found dead in the basement. Carol Ann Cooper and Lucy Partington. Both were picked up at bus stops, presumably to be driven home. Carol and Lucy were imprisoned and brutally beaten in the basement of the West, after which they were buried in the same basement under a concrete floor. In the following year, 1974, their victims were 21-year-old Swiss student Teresa Siegenthaler and 15-year-old orphan Shirley Hubbard. Both victims were picked up by the Wests on the road. Like the previous ones, Teresa and Shirley were tortured to death and then buried under the patio. In 1975, Juanita Mott, who had been renting a room from the West at the Cromwell Street house for 2 years, became another victim. She was unaware of the basement's secrets, or she would have left much sooner. In April, she disappeared, concerning her loved ones. The following day, her friends searched for her in the village. Despite everyone noticing her absence, no one reported it to the police or even discussed it among themselves. She disappeared again. Vanity's remains will be under the basement log as before. After that, Fred and Rose took a break for 3 years. They lived their best life, full of physical and sexual abuse, over children, spontaneous and neglected pregnancies, prostitution, and other twisted romance that these 2 monsters love so much. Rose's father visited West in this time. Instead, he abruptly stopped hating his daughter and decided to bless her union with Fred. Do you think this is weird? No. In fact, he came because he found out about Mandy's room and wanted to take advantage of her services. Again, this family is beyond comprehension. In 1978, Fred and Rose have a daughter named Shirley Anna Robinson. They stand alone like partners, and the women even know about the affair approximately an hour in advance. Rose and Shirley decide to have children and raise them together as a family, which becomes a pleasant surprise. But at some point, this bright picture just shattered. Rose gave birth to her child, after which she killed Shirley with her own hands, who was 8 months pregnant, after which she buried her body in the garden behind her own house. In the 79th year, Rose lost her son, the very one she loved so much, to scream, to be beaten, and to hate almost all her life. But as in this family it was the norm, Rose strongly endured her loss. To quell her pain, she seemingly found a lasting solution: alcohol. Ellison Chambers was 16 when she started working at the building on Cromwell Street, 25 as a nanny for the numerous West children. Shortly before her 17th birthday, she disappeared, and the West simply added another grave to their backyard. In that year, their eldest daughter, Anna Marie, who endured constant abuse and molestation from her parents, fled home. Now the oldest child was Heather, who was 9 at the time Fred and Rose turned their attention to her. They treated her like their other victims, but didn't kill her. This constant abuse the girl endured for another 7 years. In her teens, Heiser struggled to find work to have the chance to escape from home. She applied for a job as a cleaner, but was rejected. Rose knew about this attempt to escape and did not let it slip through her fingers. In 1987, Heather West, the first child of Fred and Rose, became their last victim. The child was 16 years old when they died. After hiding her body, Fred asked Stephen, their son with Rose, to dig a hole in the garden for a supposed fish pond. The boy did everything his father told him to, and only after 5 years did he realize that he had helped dig a grave for his own sister. Heiser's disappearance was covered up, but traces were able to find the truth. They said that the girl got that job, went there to work. That's it. Then something happened and she lives her life there. For the next 5 years, Fred and Rose continued to live just as they had before. They turned the first floor of their house almost into a full-fledged brothel, often locking the children in the basement, just so they wouldn't interfere with work. The children's drawings on the walls were made by them themselves in order to pass the time and somehow beautify the gray and unattractive basement. It appears no one was killed during this time, but this is only because there's no evidence proving otherwise. In 1992, Fred, by his own admission, killed one of his daughters named Lucy. When the girl tearfully told her mother about this, she only replied that she had asked for it herself. After that, Rose helped Fred do this to Lucy over and over again. One of the times, the man even recorded it on camera. The girl didn't talk about it at school and only told one of her friends, who in turn told her mother. So eventually the police turned their attention to West. Fred was arrested for kidnapping Louise, and Rose was arrested for child abuse. But this was just the start of the West case investigation. Any attempts to reach their children were unsuccessful, as all of them were taught not to talk about what was happening at home. In '94, the remains of 2 dismembered bodies were found in the West Garden. Fred immediately confessed his guilt about their deaths and told the police where to look for the remains of his other victims. Now in the basement of the house on Cromwell, the remains of 9 women were found. In the garden of the house on Midland Street, Charmaine, and in the garden that Fred pointed out, the remains of his first wife, Catherine Costello, as well as his lover, Anne McFall. While one of Fred's victims was talking about her experiences, another, Rose, was completely silent and tried to convince the police that she was a victim herself. Believing in this was very difficult, yet in the same year, 1994, a trial took place in which Fred was convicted of 12 murders and Rose of 10. On February 1st, 1995, Fred West hanged himself in his cell before receiving his sentence. Later that same year, Rose received her sentence, life imprisonment without the right to parole, which she is still serving. What a story, isn't it? It's just straight up trash. Honestly, it's trash. Nevertheless, see you tomorrow. There will be another video this month, so stay tuned. See you tomorrow at 8 p.m. All the best. Love and kisses. Bye.